So I've been talking about needing to train raters. So we're going to talk a little bit about rater training and the two broad types that there are. And again, the goals of training raters is first to reduce or eliminate biases. So again, make people aware of their tendency to have various biases and what those biases are. For example, the similar to me effect. That's a known psychological phenomenon, and it's a minor one. And what I mean by minor is it doesn't cause huge shifts. So if there's someone that is similar to you that is clearly underperforming, and there's someone that's very dissimilar to you that's clearly a top performer, then this bias is not going to result in you basically rating the way you shouldn't, unless you are truly, shall we say, knowingly being biased. So most of the time when we're talking about bias, we're not talking about outright discrimination. We're not talking about someone actively and knowingly trying to reduce the success of individuals simply because of a stereotypical trait or a category they belong to. What we're usually talking about is more of subtle forms of bias or when people aren't aware of it. So the similar to me effect, for example, that happens when you have two people that are actually fairly similar in performance. In other words, it is a tough call. Maybe one of them's a little ahead of the other one in one area, but a little behind in the other. And it's an area where a choice has to be made. And that's where similar to me bias can step in. Generally speaking, the more similar someone is to us in every possible aspect, the more likely we are to have a subtle bias towards them. So if you are, for example, for me, if you're male, honestly, if you're Caucasian American, if you are brown haired, if you have a beard, if you wear glasses, if you're about 50, if you're from the Midwest, if you have a higher degree, master's or PhD, if you happen to like heavy metal, all of those are bits of information that tell me you are similar to me. Which means, again, if I'm having to make a decision between two people that are fairly close on most objective ratings, there's a chance that I'm going to go without even realizing with the person that is similar to me. So again, a lot of times when we're talking about bias, we tend to think of them as huge effects. Generally speaking, they're not. Biases, politics, and stereotypes usually function in the margins. They function when it's not a clear decision. And if we look at a series of decisions, we tend to find that someone may be moving towards their bias or their politics. So we want to make people aware of these biases. We're not going to be able to actually eliminate them. They're functions of how we function. Stereotypes are how we function in the world. We create mental examples of behaviors we expect from almost everything we run into, and not just people, animals, machines, even environments. We all have stereotypes of what going to the bathroom should be like. And if something violates that assumption, if something's different, it tends to be something that sets us off our game. So again, it's not necessarily that we are out to eliminate stereotypes. And anytime I hear someone talk about that, I don't think they have a good basis in cognitive psychology, because stereotypes, the neutral term stereotype, is how we process information. We're not going to be able to eliminate that if we're still human. What we want to be aware, though, is when do stereotypes start to bias decision making, and how can we make sure that we're aware of those biases to where we can operate around them and make sure that we are making the right decision. So that's a part of it. The next part of rater training is actually just improving observational skills. So if we're really trying to figure out how someone performs, we need to make sure we have good data, and a lot of times that good data involves actually making sure we have the opportunity to look at work products, to look at how the person behaves, to get observations, and to make sure those observations are accurate observations of the behavior that we're supposed to be rating. And finally, improving communication with employees. So once you have the ratings, hopefully with bias reduced or removed, and based on good observations, how do you communicate that performance appraisal in a way that employees will actually understand and respond positively to? How do you have a coaching session? So rater training can include all of these. It can include methods to reduce or eliminate or make people aware of biases when they happen and how to reduce them. It can focus on improving observational skills, and it can focus on better coaching and better delivery of the feedback in a way that actually results in the employee incorporating that feedback and using that feedback to be a better employee and to basically be more in line with the company's goals. So as far as behavior, as far as training, looking at actual increasing the observation, a lot of it's formed around cognitive processing models. In other words, most training that's about being a better observer is about recognizing the processes of cognitive psychology that are necessary for you to get the information and make sure the information is accurate to be able to do ratings. So broadly speaking, one of the things that we often talk about in such training is the five-step cognitive process of performance appraisal. That in order to do a performance appraisal, the first step is you have to observe the behavior in the first place. In other words, if you are never observing your employees, your direct reports, working, if you never actually see their products, if you never actually get observations of those behaviors, then you can't do a performance appraisal. You have to observe the behavior. But even if you observe the behavior, you now need to encode information about the behavior. In other words, you need to be able to interpret the information. Do you actually understand the job enough to understand what you just saw? Do you understand the job enough to know if that was a typical behavior or an extreme behavior or a rare behavior? So again, if all you've done is 2 observations over 6 months and each observation was 5 minutes, and you just happen to observe someone at their worst, are you recognizing that's probably not typical behavior? So that's kind of going back to observed behavior too. In order to observe behavior, we also need to observe it enough to where we can kind of factor out if we get randomly a very good behavior or a very poor behavior in a small number of behaviors. So kind of think about it the same way you might think about statistical power. If you only have 5 people in your study is more susceptible to random differences in those people. In other words, if I only have 5 people and one of them happens to be a 3 standard deviations above the mean genius, that group is probably going to outperform any other average group of 5 people because of who's in it. So that's random fluctuation. Now, the same with behaviors. If all I'm doing is observing 5 behaviors over 6 months, that's a small sample of behaviors, and I might capture someone at their best or worst and think that is indicative of their behavior. So the more we can observe behavior, the more observations we have, the less likely those observations are susceptible to extremely good or poor behavior if those are rare behaviors. And more likely that if we saw extremely poor behavior multiple times, we can trust that that's really a representation of that employee's behavior. So we need to make sure we're doing enough behaviors and that we're encoding and understanding the behaviors. Now we have to store the behaviors because again, we may be doing these observations over months before we actually sit down to do the performance appraisal. When we do the performance appraisal, we have to retrieve that information, and to write the performance appraisal or to rate the person, we need to integrate the information into the scales and understand those scales. So this is actually a fairly complex cognitive process to do well. So a lot of times the training is going to focus on the first 2, making sure you're observing the behavior enough to be confident that you're getting an adequate read of the behavior and that you understand the behavior and the job enough to be able to encode that information. Now, storing and retrieval information, that is where notes, computer files, basically, help your own self with this information. Come up with a way of encoding and then writing down what you saw, writing down the observations. So that makes it a lot easier to retrieve that information accurately when it comes up compared to just simply hoping that memory will serve. So finally, the integration of the information, that usually is where we actually train people on the use of the scales and how they apply those observations that they made to actually representing fairly the person on the scales that they finally fill out as a part of the performance appraisal. So the next thing we would look at is training that often looks at basically common rater errors and how to actually assess those, be aware of them, and make sure that you're not doing them. One of the first things we look at and talk about, and again, this is mainly informing people of cognitive difficulties or cognitive biases that we all have. One of them is halo error. So halo error is that if we've observed one particular aspect of someone's behavior, so let's say we're rating someone on 5 key aspects, but we've only observed one, but the one that we observed was very, very positive. They really were good at that one thing. Halo error means that we have a tendency, without actually data, to assume they're doing well at everything else at their job. So we want to make sure that if we're rating someone, we're not allowing their good performance in one area to influence positively our scores on their behaviors and others, especially if we don't have data. Now, we do also want to be aware that we want to make sure that we're not ignoring true halo. There are some people that truly are exceptional on all ratings of their job. They're truly high performers. So it's not that a truly high performer, someone that gets high ratings on everything, means that we've done halo error. But we should at least examine those high ratings to make sure that that's not what happened. The next is a set of distributional errors. And we find that there's a problem here both with one single rater, but also with raters across the organization. So the first thing we're going to look at is just the individual raters. So there's leniency errors. What this means is it's a manager that basically either is lazy or a combination of lazy and also wants to be well liked. So basically they rate everyone at the top of the scale. They basically say all of their direct reports are doing very well. Now again, just like halo error, we do want to be cautious and make sure that it is not necessarily reflecting true high performance. Let's say you have a manager whose direct reports, they've got 5 of them, and all of them are probably the 5 best employees in the entire company. That wouldn't be leniency, that would be accuracy. So it's not that we're going to discount a manager or a rater simply because they rate everyone highly, but we do want to ask the question, is it happening because they truly are top performers, or is it happening because of leniency? Central tendency is basically, I really just don't want to make decisions. So this is more pure laziness to some degree. So instead of rating anyone high or anyone low, I'm going to just rate everyone in the center of the scale. It means that I can have the same conversation with all my employees. It means that I don't have to praise anyone, but I also don't have to insult anyone or discipline anyone. And finally, there's severity. This is often a manager that believes kind of in an old school theory X management style of the only way to motivate people is to correct them and to yell at them and to give them negative feedback. So they rate everyone, even their top performers, very low. Now, again, we always, with all of these, central tendency, leniency, and severity, we do want to ask the question, does this manager actually just have a bunch of meh employees, central tendency? Does this manager actually have a bunch of direct reports that are all underperforming? Those wouldn't be severity, central tendency, or leniency errors. That would be true high ratings, true medium ratings, or true low ratings. But generally speaking, especially if the person's rating a lot of employees, a lot of direct reports, the chances that everyone is high, or everyone's in the middle, or everyone's low is pretty low. This usually is an indication of one of these errors. So that the problem with this on an individual level is we aren't getting information that can be used for any type of decision making. And honestly, the employees aren't getting any kind of meaningful feedback from this process. They're either all being told they do poorly, all being told they did well, or all being told they're just okay. That's not a lot for people to work with. Also, organizationally, this becomes a bigger problem. If you have multiple managers at the same level, and 4 of them are filling out the forms like they're supposed to. So they're using the full scale, their very top performers are getting high ratings, their average performers are getting moderate ratings, and their low performers are getting low ratings. But then you have a single manager that gives everyone high ratings, and a single manager giving everyone low ratings. You now can't really use those ratings across those managers to find out who actually is your top performers because people are using the scales differently. So generally, when we're doing rater error training on distributional errors, it's making sure that everyone's on the same page, is using the scale fully, and recognizes that leniency, central tendency, and severity are not just an individual problem, they're also a problem organizational-wide. Other errors that might be discussed, and again, all of these are based on kind of sound psychological studies of how we process information, includes recency error and also first impression or primacy effect error. And generally speaking, what we find here is that recency error is when the last person rated or the last person observed gets the higher rating. First impression or primacy effect is that the first person observed or the first person looked at is usually going to get the positive ratings by comparison. Also, first impression represents the fact that we tend to overvalue our initial bits of observation that we get from someone. So first impressions do tend to matter because they tend to set a framework in our mind of what we expect from this employee. So if we have a very good first impression of someone, we tend to look for good behavior. If we have a very poor impression of someone initially, we tend to look for bad behavior. So we also make people aware of this in common rater error training. As far as recency and primacy, they seem to fight each other. So you're telling me that the first person I observe is going to get higher ratings and the last person I observe is going to get higher ratings. This actually really depends on when the ratings are happening. Recency error usually occurs, in other words, the last person you observe, the most recent observation is usually the best, usually when there's a time period between the ratings and when you're actually doing the scores. In other words, the last person that you looked at was probably the one you remember the best. First impression or primacy is often when it's actually being done immediately. So in that case, we actually are immediately doing an observation. We observe multiple people in a very short period of time and immediately make a decision. In that case, primacy effect usually takes hold. And finally, I already kind of talked about similar to me error, and just recognize that similar to me error is a small effect. Most of these are to some degree, but the more similar they are to you, the more it starts to compound. So again, as we find more and more similarity, we find more and more of this error. And again, this error does not occur when there's vast differences between people evaluated. It's in those margins when they're fairly close. So there's basically two broad types of rater training. The first one is rater error training. Teaches raters to avoid common rating errors, distributional and contrast errors. It tends to reduce error, not so much accuracy. So again, this isn't a golden ticket to making sure that all of your systems work better. What it does tend to do is get everyone on the same page a little bit better. You tend to find that ratings tend to become more standardized between different units or different managers. But as far as accuracy, and again, by accuracy, I mean top versus bottom performers, we don't find a huge effect here. And again, that's probably because, for the most part, most of these errors are either occurring throughout everyone. In other words, even someone that has severity or leniency will still probably be able to identify their top performer if they had to for decision making. And usually when we measure accuracy in performance appraisals, we're actually asking, are the decisions matching top versus bottom performers? And again, a lot of these errors happen in the margins, which means that it might be the 3 top performers, and that similar to me effect means you chose someone a little more similar to you out of those 3 applicants, but they're still a top performer. So we usually don't find a huge increase in actual accuracy identifying top and bottom performers, but we do tend to find a more uniform use of the scales and a reduction in some of the bias in politics, especially in the margins. The second type of training is actually frame of reference training. And this is a little more complex, but this is actually more about how do you use the existing scales. So it's not focused on errors, it's focused on simply, if you have a graphic rating scale of 1 to 7, how do we expect you to use this? So it establishes a common frame of reference, and it involves rating practice and an explanation of the expert ratings. And this has been shown to increase rater accuracy, both individually and within an organization, and it's based on behavioral observation training. So this is usually where we're going to focus on how do you observe behaviors, how do you observe enough behaviors, how do you interpret those behaviors, and then how do you apply those behaviors when you have to use the scale. And a lot of times it will include both experts walking all of the supervisors through the scale. What do the experts expect a 1, a 2, a 3 to mean? They also will then include examples. So a lot of frame of reference training will be, for example, having everyone in the room observe a video of an employee performing and then have them do ratings. And then they look to see how did those ratings differ. Now the goal is not perfect correlation where everyone always rates the same. But for example, if everyone watched a behavior and 5 of the managers rated it as either a 3 or a 4, and 1 manager rated it as a 5, and 1 manager rated it as a 1, we would start probably talking about distributional errors, but we're also talking about, okay, why did you rate it as a 1? And through this process, all the supervisors start to understand how everyone else is using the scale, which means they tend to use the scales more successfully and correctly, and at least in using the same, well, frame of reference. So let's briefly talk about, beyond training the raters, how we actually use that performance appraisal to manage. So this is more about the coaching and the delivery of the feedback. And this is usually referred to as performance management, a system or process of using performance appraisal to actually increase performance in the organization. So the definition is a motivational system of individual performance improvement. It includes objective goal setting. So in other words, if you are talking about an area that needs worked on, as a manager and an employee, a direct report and a supervisor, what you want to talk about is how do we actually fix this? What goals do we need to set? What's realistic, and how can I help you get to those goals as your supervisor? Once those goals are set, continuing a process of coaching and feedback, continuing the performance appraisal system to see if that actually performance results in higher scores, and continuing developmental planning. So a lot of times, again, we want the components of this goal setting, of this feedback, of this planning to be linked to the company goals and to be linked to the actual performance appraisal and the job analysis itself. So performance management is supposed to be implemented, if it is actually being done correctly, on a continuous cycle. So in other words, this should be a process where it's not just once a year and then everyone forgets their goals, but where there is a meeting where goals are set, where performance appraisal is measured and basically feedback is given, that then through the process moving up to the next performance appraisal, there will be coaching and feedback, and then as the next performance appraisal, you'll look to see, did we see improvement? How do we develop this further? What is the plan? So the steps in the performance management process, when done correctly, starts with a job analysis. So again, in order for you to be able to measure performance, you have to know what the job actually entails and what needs to be done to perform the job well. You then need to develop that performance measure. So sometimes these will already be done, but I just want to make it very clear that step 1 and step 2 need to exist prior to a performance management system. Again, they're the base of the pyramid, and without it, the structure collapses. Once you have the performance measure system that's tied to the job analysis, you now need to come up with a way to communicate the performance standards. In other words, if you're expecting the following behaviors for people to get exceeds expectations, you need to let them know what that is. What do they need to do to get there? Once you've set those standards and once you've clearly communicated to everyone that is going to be actually in this performance management system, now you need to make sure that you're giving your managers, your supervisors, the time and the resources to observe that performance, that they understand and have been trained in how to rate that job performance, and then they know how to do a performance appraisal review. They know how to have that coaching session where they set goals and they work with the employee to make sure those goals are realistic to improve performance, and then they have the time and resources to do follow-ups, to do coaching, to check in. Is that performance improving? So again, we're implementing performance improvement plans, and we're also administrating rewards and punishments based on those performance appraisals. This is the process that we want to move towards in organizations. If we're doing performance appraisal, obviously we can use it for decision making and research, but the performance management system is how we actually make it developmental to increase the skill sets and the performance of each individual, and therefore hopefully increase the performance of the entire organization.